Steven, I have to tell you about a dream I had 2 nights ago.
Just before you say anything else, this is maybe the most out of the Aether appropriate prompt of all time. I had a dream last night. Continue.
I had a dream 2 nights ago that you and me were sitting in an event. It was like a PlayStation event at like an E3 or a Summer Games Fest or something like that. They were announcing all this different stuff. They were announcing all these games left and right. And then whoever was the president, it was a dream, so I don't know who's president, I guess, in my dream world. But the president...
Of the country or of Sony?
Sorry, of PlayStation specifically.
Okay. I was like,
Joe Biden shows up.
Yeah.
The president of PlayStation gets up on stage and he's like, all these games are really exciting, but I'm sure you're wondering like what's next hardware wise for PlayStation. And he's like, now, before you get too excited, we're not talking about the PlayStation 6 today. That's going to be down the line. We haven't even talked about the PlayStation 5 Pro yet. I'm here to announce something even more exciting because we think that the future is actually lying in the past. And he reaches into his pocket and he pulls out and holds up into the air the PlayStation Vita. He says, no changes, same catalog. The PlayStation Vita is back.
Oh my God.
And people in my dream, like, I obviously was losing my fucking mind.
Yeah.
And everyone in the theater just stood up, like standing ovation, losing it at the announcement that the PlayStation Vita was back. And I immediately woke up after that. But my feeling about this is just like, if Sony decided to do that, I think that people would be excited. I don't want to be like too in my own like nostalgia glasses world about the PlayStation Vita. I understand that it was like an abject failure of a device. It did not do very well.
Sure. It's a little bit like we're bringing back the Zune,
right?
In terms of just performance and reception.
It would be for such a niche audience. Like,
yes, exactly.
Some people would be so excited about it, but it would not be like the next phase of PlayStation. That having been said, I do think that in a world where like the Playdate exists and all of these retro handhelds exist and things like the Ain Odin exist, Xbox is like thinking about getting into handhelds. Sony now has the PlayStation Portal. There is kind of a world in which I think if PlayStation did that, it would be legitimately exciting to be like, not only are we turning all the servers back on, you can still download all those games. We're committed to the game preservation of the PlayStation Vita library, but also we're opening it up so more developers can continue making games with those same limitations, the same hardware. It feels to me like a PlayStation version of the Playdate, where it's like it's a smaller device that is less powerful than a lot of the stuff that we're building for now, and those limitations can create like really interesting, cool games. And I feel like people would embrace it. And I maybe that's just me, but I have been thinking about this dream nonstop for like actually 48 hours. I can't stop thinking about it, and I keep opening up notes apps and writing out like more stuff that I would love if the PlayStation Vita were just to come back completely unchanged.
I'm not kidding you, Brendan. I literally had this conversation at lunch the other day at work.
What?
Where I was talking to friends at work, yes, about the PSP and the Vita, and I said something along the lines of the Vita, if it came out 10 years later, would have been huge, because I feel like you have Persona 4 Golden, which is like still a huge hit.
Yes.
Would still be like a system seller for a much larger group of people now than even in 2012.
Right.
You have the OLED screen, and you also just, again, like the thriving market of even niche handhelds. You have the Sony name attached to it. It's going to do better than a lot of those niche ones that are already doing pretty okay.
Yes.
I don't think your dream is as ludicrous as maybe you feared it was. Now, do I expect that to happen? Absolutely not.
No, definitely not. Yeah.
I think it also speaks volumes to, if I can pivot to my psychologist chair for a bit.
By all means.
At least from my perspective, like, we talk a lot about all the big publishers' strategy in this generation, like Nintendo and Xbox and Sony, and how Sony has kind of been resting on their laurels in this generation. And I don't think it takes an especially critical eye to see that the PS5 has kind of just like paused itself due to that. I don't want to say complacency, because I don't want to undermine the work that has gone into a lot of those games that are great. But I think when you are in a creative field and you take the approach of, we figured out what works and we're just going to keep doing that. And the only real upgrade is the technology. I think that like really is not exciting to me at all. And I can't help but look at, and you know, we're of a certain age that is like positioned to be nostalgic. You know, I think when you enter your 30s, I think like you yourself and every marketing team on earth is like, remember this, you know? And I think,
yeah, like if we walked into an Applebee's right now, they'd be playing music from when we were in high school.
Dude, Third Eye Blind? No, actually, that was before, but you get the point. Anyway, like, I try to avoid thinking, like, I think it's really easy to look at any period in history and think, remember then? And it's like I had a friend who was like, I wish it was 2002. And I'm like, I understand what you mean by that, but do you remember what was happening historically in 2002? It was not a great year.
Right.
All that being said, all that kind of, being critical of falling into the pitfall of nostalgia, I can't help but yearn for the Sony days where like they didn't have their identity figured out yet. They were releasing PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale as their attempt at an identity, and it was a nightmare. And even though like on one hand that was an awkward era for them, the PS3 and prior, there was a willingness on the financial end of things to invest in new games and new ideas. And a lot of them didn't work and didn't stick around, but there was a lot of creativity and a lot of new things happening, including the Vita. Now that we're at a time where I think like, even though The Last of Us is still huge and a lot of these franchises they've fully invested in will still do well and are still popular, I think there is that feeling of like what's next for Sony. And also in a larger point, like I think there's an uncertainty about what's next just sort of for consoles in general. Like I was talking to
I was gonna say for
about,
like video games, period.
Yeah, because as much as like if you ask me, you know, what do I want from the new Switch? Basically, like I want a Switch that isn't considering itself existing in the days of dial-up internet. Like I want a Switch that is like on par with modern hardware. As someone who like doesn't care about frame rate, I want a Switch that just like has access to modern displays and internet and has backwards compatibility. That's all I really need. At the same time, though, I'm like, all these handhelds are coming out and everything is kind of heading towards this singularity of games where like every console is like kind of the same. Xbox doesn't care if you have an Xbox. On one hand, that's really nice because I like that we're moving away from exclusivity, and I think that's like better for people economically overall. To not have like, we're moving away from the days where you need to spend $500 to get another console just to play one game, you know?
Right.
Like I don't think that's where we should stay, but playing stuff like the Playdate and thinking about older Nintendo consoles like the DS, where like you said, that limitation or that gimmick, if you want to call it that, informed design. You know, limitations inform style.
Right.
Actually, just I was in an art class and the teacher was saying like it was for character design, and he was like, when you are thinking about character design or anything as an artist, like think about your strengths, think about your limits, but don't confuse your limits for weakness. Your limits may actually inform what your style is. So think about like, you know, if you say like, oh, I'm not good at drawing hands, maybe practice drawing hands. But if you're like, I'm not interested in adding these specific details in my art, then maybe you're better suited for a more simple style. That doesn't mean it's less sophisticated. Like artists like Brian Lee O'Malley or like the art style of Wind Waker are technically simple, but they're stunning and gripping and iconic, you know? Yeah. So I think the same is true with games. I know I'm going all over the place, but like I think for hardware, on one hand, yes, I expect and kind of want most games to be available in most places. And we kind of figured out that most games should be played in a certain way, but I don't want to lose those places within the game world that like innovate and that push design forward by adding weird parameters, you know? Like a friend of mine was like, what if the new Nintendo console is just a whip? Like, what if it's like
the Nintendo Switch?
Yeah, it's just a whip, and it's like a skip it or something. You know, the more I think about what I want from a Switch 2, the more I think I want them to just go crazy, because I don't expect that from Xbox, and I don't expect that from PlayStation at this point. So all that to say, I think your dream of wanting the Vita back speaks volumes in a lot of different ways. I think it was a prophecy, really.
That was a very earnest response to my very silly dream.
Sorry.
Which I appreciate. Don't apologize for that. How dare you?
I want the Nintendo Whip.
I want the Nintendo Whip, definitely.
The Nintendo Snap.
I have a PlayStation Vita. I mean, I'm looking at it right now. I'm holding it in my hand right now. It's the original like launch version of the PlayStation Vita. It is still, I think, one of the best consoles ever made from a handheld perspective, from like a design perspective. You know, they took every single little piece of feedback from the PlayStation Portable and just implemented it into this thing. You have the second analog stick. You have a touchscreen that's OLED, as you were mentioning. For some reason, there's capacitive, there's a capacitive back screen, so you can like press fake buttons on the back screen that act as L2 and R2 as well. There's like cameras on it. Like, it feels like the closest Sony has ever gotten to being Nintendo in maybe the most complimentary way I could possibly say that. And the thing about the PlayStation Vita that really stuck with me, and that I'm seeing a lot on the Playdate right now, is like indie developers really clung to it. Like, all of my favorite indie games launched on the PlayStation Vita in the time that the Vita was around. Like Rogue Legacy, Nuclear Throne, Spelunky, RPGs, as you were mentioning. But like, I think just generally speaking, the fact that indies were like, yeah, this thing is powerful enough to run the stuff that we're building for PC. But also we were in that era of indie games where like almost all of them were going after that kind of like 2D pixel art style. It just made it such a natural extension of that like boom in indie games that was happening in like the early 2010s. And that boom has not really ever stopped since then. You know, regardless of what's going on with the three major console manufacturers, that indie scene has been so vibrant and rich ever since, and has only expanded more as tools have gotten like more elaborate and allowing people to branch out into more 3D spaces. But still, the PlayStation Vita just like feels like a device that really just has untapped potential. Like, a lot of people know this about the PlayStation Vita, but if you don't, it launched kind of in conjunction with the PlayStation 4, specifically as a remote play device for the PS4. So you could like get a PS4 in your house, but you could also play your PS4 from your Vita, which is a thing I used to do a lot and really enjoyed doing. But in the early years of the PS4, despite the fact that Xbox like totally just smashed their own fingers in their car door by announcing that it was a set-top box instead of a video game console in that first announcement, the PlayStation 4 still wasn't selling as well as they wanted initially, and their game library was not really like up to snuff, or at least wasn't.
It took a few years. I feel like and that's kind of how every PlayStation was. I remember when even PS2 came out. Like, you know, I was 9, so maybe not fully aware of the world yet, but like, I distinctly remember being like, well, there's the Bouncer and Tekken Tag. And it wasn't until like a couple years later, like in 2000, 2001, Final Fantasy X came out, and there were like really big titles for the PS2.
Yeah, and they ran into that with the PS4, and they were also trying to support the PlayStation Vita at the same time. Yeah. And you know, from what we know, at least at this point, you know, looking back retrospectively, they looked at their development lineup and they were like, we can't be supporting both of these consoles simultaneously, and the PlayStation 4 is the one that most people will probably buy, so that's what we should invest in when it comes to creating software. So they just kind of like bailed on the Vita like pretty immediately. Like, it really only had about 1 to 1.5 years of like a good run at it, and then it suddenly faded into the background as like an accessory to your PS4 more than it was anything else, which led to the PlayStation TV, which ended up being like a little set-top box that you could buy that was the internals of a Vita without the screen or the buttons, that you could just pair a DualShock to and then like have as a quote-unquote second PS4 in your house without actually needing to buy a second PS4. Kind of a smart idea, but like really that announcement was the moment where I, as a person who was a diehard fan of the Vita at the time, was like, Vita no longer means life. Vita is dead. Like, this is it. They're done. They're out on this. But that having been said, I'm still playing it a lot. We're doing a bonus episode about the Uncharted franchise, and I've been playing the PlayStation Vita Uncharted game a little bit in preparation for that, which I weirdly had never played despite being a big Uncharted fan. When the Vita came out, it just like didn't even occur to me to get the Uncharted game that was on there. And I've been playing it. It's like miraculous what this machine is still capable of. It's miraculous what stuff they were able to build out for the PlayStation Vita at that time. And I just feel so strongly that if you just put this as a dev kit in the hands of developers again, they would make some really incredible stuff. I feel like one of the best examples of this is probably Tearaway, which is by Media Molecule, who made Little Big Planet, which is like a Mario-esque platformer that uses all of the features I described: the touchscreen on the front, the touchscreen on the back, the cameras even to create this like really vibrant, weird space that feels so Nintendo. It feels like a Nintendo DS or 3DS kind of like brain blast idea in execution. And it feels like the stuff that we're seeing as we were talking about on the Playdate. I think you could just re-release the Vita again right now and it would probably be more successful than it was then, or at least more people would be interested in it, because at this point in time, I think the rise of the Nintendo Switch and then subsequently the Steam Deck pointing the direction of gaming into the handheld market more so than ever before, despite, you know, the handheld market being around since the Game Boy and before that. Now is the time where it's really taking off and you can have those experiences that are what we used to consider console based or like home television, living room based. And you can have them on the subway and you can have them in a park down the street from your house and you can have them on an airplane. You know, pair to that, the rise of emulators, the rise of like full AAA games just like being released on the iOS App Store and the Google Play Store. And you kind of have all the makings of a world in which the PlayStation Vita succeeds in 2024 better than it did in 2012.
I totally agree. What would you call it, though? We need a new name.
Does it? Vita. Or is it just the Vita?
Is it just the Vita with 2 capital I's in between? The Vita. That's a Nintendo move.
That's a Nintendo move.
Because I'm telling you, tonight, Brendan, I'm going to have a full body sweat nightmare that the next Switch is going to be the Wii U 2. And that will be next week's episode.
I have been worried that they're going to call it the Switch. And it's the 2 eyes.
Why don't we think about what we've learned today and call it here? Because I don't know if I could actually hear anything inside my brain right now but the Switch.
The Switch.
The Switch.
Well,
I look forward to the Vita's future.
Me too. Our future's in the past, Stephen.
Our future's in the past. Thank you. Thank your subconscious for guiding the way.
Bye, everybody.
See ya.